Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning of November 12th, 2006, arrived in Fairview, Pennsylvania, the way most November mornings did in that quiet corner of Erie County. Cold, gray, and unremarkable. The town itself was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the main street consisted of a single grocery store, a post office, a diner that served breakfast all day, and a hardware store that had been run by the same family for 3 generations. Fairview was not the kind of town where things happened. It was the kind of town people moved to precisely because things didn't happen there. The population hovered around 800 souls, give or take a few births and deaths each year, and most families had roots that stretched back decades. Their histories intertwined like the branches of the old oaks that lined the residential streets. Daniel Mercer was 10 years old that autumn, a small boy for his age with sandy brown hair that his mother was always trying to keep combed down, and hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with quiet intensity. He was not the kind of child who demanded attention. He didn't raise his hand first in class or score the winning goals at recess soccer games. He was gentle, thoughtful, the kind of boy who would spend an entire afternoon watching ants carry crumbs across the sidewalk, or who could identify every bird that visited the feeder his grandfather had built and hung in the backyard. His teacher, Mrs. Patricia Holm, had taught in Fairview for 23 years, and often remarked that Daniel was one of those rare students who actually listened when she read aloud, whose eyes would track the words, as if he were storing them somewhere deep inside for later. Daniel lived with his mother, Grace Mercer, in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, painted a faded yellow that Grace kept meaning to refresh, but never quite found the time or money to do. Grace worked as a medical transcriptionist from home, spending her days typing up doctor's notes and hospital reports, her fingers flying across the keyboard while she sat in the small office she'd carved out of what used to be a sewing room. She was 34 years old, had been raising Daniel alone since his father, Marcus, had died in a construction accident when Daniel was only 3. Grace had dark circles under her eyes that never quite went away, evidence of the long nights she worked to make ends meet. But she had a warm smile that she reserved especially for her son, and neighbors often commented on how devoted she was, how she never missed a parent-teacher conference or a school play, no matter how many deadlines she had piling up. That Sunday morning, Daniel had asked if he could go to his best friend Tommy Brennan's house after church. Grace had agreed, as she always did when the weather wasn't too terrible, and Daniel's homework was finished. Tommy lived less than half a mile away on the other side of the neighborhood, and the boys had been inseparable since kindergarten. They shared the same birthday, October 14th, which both boys insisted meant they were practically twins despite looking nothing alike. Tommy was stocky and loud, where Daniel was slight and soft-spoken, but somehow the friendship worked. They spent hours building elaborate structures out of whatever materials they could find, cardboard boxes transformed into castles, old boards nailed together into what they insisted was a treehouse, even though it sat firmly on the ground, collections of rocks organized into what Daniel called museums and Tommy called treasure hoards. Grace had dropped Daniel off at the Brennan house around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, after a lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. She had reminded him, as she always did, to be home by 5 for dinner and to call if he was going to be late. Daniel had nodded, kissed her cheek with the unself-conscious affection of a child who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by parental displays, and bounded up the Brennans' front steps where Tommy was already waiting, holding what appeared to be a large cardboard tube that he'd salvaged from somewhere. The hours passed the way Sunday afternoons do when you're 10 years old and the world still feels infinite. The boys played in Tommy's backyard, constructing an elaborate telescope from the cardboard tube, aluminum foil, and an old magnifying glass Tommy's father had let them have. They took turns looking through it at the neighbor's cat, at passing cars, at the clouds that hung low and heavy with the promise of early winter. Tommy's mother, Susan Brennan, brought them hot chocolate around 3:30 and reminded them that the temperature was dropping, that they should probably come inside soon. But boys of that age feel invincible against weather, and they promised they would, just a few more minutes, just until they finished their observation of what Daniel insisted was probably Mars, even though Tommy was pretty sure it was just a plane. At 4:30, as the sun began its early November descent, and the air took on that particular bite that promised frost by morning, Daniel announced he should probably head home. Grace liked dinner on the table by 5:15, and Daniel was the kind of kid who didn't like to disappoint. He said goodbye to Tommy, thanked Mrs. Brennan for the hot chocolate, and set off on the route he'd walked dozens of times before. Red Maple Road was the most direct path between the Brennan house and Daniel's home on Elm Street. It was a narrow country road, barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other, that cut through what remained of old farmland on the eastern edge of Fairview. Most of the farms had been abandoned years ago, when the families who'd worked them either died off or moved to places with better soil and better prospects. What remained were weathered barns with collapsing roofs, rusted farm equipment slowly being reclaimed by weeds, and row after row of old maple trees that gave the road its name. In summer, those maples formed a canopy of green that dappled the pavement with shifting shadows. In autumn, they dropped leaves in shades of red and gold so vibrant that people from neighboring towns would drive through just to take pictures. But by mid-November, the trees were bare, their branches reaching up like skeletal fingers against the gray sky, and the road had taken on a desolate quality that made it feel older than it was, like something from a time before the town, before the houses, before any of it. The road stretched about 3/4 of a mile from end to end. For a 10-year-old boy walking at a steady pace, it should have taken no more than 15 minutes to traverse. There were only 3 houses along the entire stretch. The first belonged to the Kowalski family, elderly Polish immigrants who kept to themselves and whose property was marked by a sagging fence and an overgrown garden that had once been meticulously maintained. The second house was actually a small cottage that served as a vacation rental, mostly empty except during summer months, when people from Pittsburgh or Philadelphia would rent it for a week of what the brochures called authentic rural experience. And the third was the Hendricks place, where Harold Hendricks, a 76-year-old widower, lived alone with his 3 cats and his collections of National Geographic magazines that dated back to the 1940s. Daniel Mercer left Tommy Brennan's house at 4:30 in the afternoon. He should have arrived home by 4:45 at the latest. By 5:15, when Grace called out that dinner was ready and received no response, she felt the first flutter of concern. By 5:30, when she'd checked his room, the backyard, and had called the Brennan house only to learn that Daniel had left on schedule over an hour ago, the concern had crystallized into something sharper. By 6 o'clock, when the sun had fully set and the temperature had dropped to 34 degrees, and she'd driven the route twice, calling his name out her car window, Grace Mercer's world had narrowed to a single, terrible focus. She called the Fairview Police Department at 6:13. The call was logged by Officer Raymond Torres, who had been with the department for 6 years, and who initially suggested that Daniel had probably just stopped to explore somewhere and lost track of time. Grace, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't quite articulate, insisted that Daniel never lost track of time, that he always called, that something was wrong. Officer Torres, hearing the edge in her voice and remembering his own mother's intuition from his childhood, dispatched units immediately. Chief Martin Burke arrived at the Mercer house within 20 minutes. Burke was a large man, 53 years old, with a face that had been weathered by 3 decades of police work, first in Philadelphia, and then, after his wife's death from cancer, in Fairview, where he'd taken the chief position hoping for something quieter, something less soul-destroying than city crime. He sat at Grace's kitchen table, taking notes in his careful, precise handwriting, while she explained everything. What Daniel had been wearing, a blue jacket over a gray hoodie, jeans, and his favorite sneakers with the red stripes. Where he'd been, the route he should have taken, his usual habits. And most importantly, the absolute certainty in her voice that Daniel would not simply wander off without permission. By 7 o'clock, every available officer in Fairview's small department, all 9 of them, was either driving the roads or walking the route between the Brennan house and the Mercer home, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices calling Daniel's name. Chief Burke established a command post in the police station and contacted the Pennsylvania State Police for additional resources. The Brennans, stricken with a guilt that was irrational but no less powerful, joined the search. Tommy, crying and insisting it was his fault for not walking Daniel home, had to be comforted by his father while his mother walked Red Maple Road over and over, as if the sheer repetition might somehow produce the missing boy. Word spread through Fairview the way news always spread in small towns. Through phone calls and visits, through whispered conversations at doorsteps, and increasingly frantic posts on the community email list that someone had started the year before. By 8 o'clock, more than 50 townspeople had gathered at the municipal building, organizing themselves into search parties. Chief Burke divided them into groups, assigned each a section of the town and surrounding areas to cover, and sent them out with flashlights, reflective vests, and strict instructions to call immediately if they found anything. Not to touch anything that might be evidence. The search continued through the night. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Frost formed on the windshields of parked cars and on the bare branches of the maple trees. Grace Mercer refused to leave the command post, refused to go home, refused to do anything except stare at the maps spread across Chief Burke's desk and trace with her finger the route her son should have taken, as if by touching the paper she could somehow reach through to wherever he was. By Monday morning, when the weak November sun rose over Fairview and illuminated a town that had barely slept, Daniel Mercer had been missing for 15 hours. The search expanded. The state police brought in tracking dogs, German shepherds trained to follow scent trails. They started at the Brennan house, let the dogs smell a shirt from Daniel's laundry hamper that Grace had brought, and watched as the animals put their noses to the ground and pulled their handlers toward Red Maple Road. The dogs followed the scent for approximately half a mile, to a point roughly midway between the Brennan house and the Mercer home. And then they stopped, circling in confusion, unable to pick up the trail beyond that spot. The area where the dogs lost the scent became the focal point of the investigation. It was a particularly desolate stretch of Red Maple Road, bordered on one side by the collapsed remains of what had once been the Jeffries dairy barn, and on the other by dense woods that extended for several miles before giving way to state game lands. Crime scene technicians combed the area, searching for any physical evidence footprints, disturbed vegetation, torn fabric, anything that might indicate what had happened. They found nothing obvious. The ground was hard from recent cold, not conducive to clear footprints. There were no signs of a struggle, no abandoned bicycle or dropped backpack or any of the items Daniel had been carrying. Chief Burke established a timeline based on what they knew. Daniel had left the Brennan house at 4:30. Susan Brennan had watched him walk to the end of her driveway and turn onto Red Maple Road, the last confirmed sighting. The route was 3/4 of a mile. Even walking slowly, he should have been home by 4:50, giving him 20 minutes before he was expected. Somewhere in that 15-minute window, somewhere along that 3/4 mile stretch of rural road, a 10-year-old boy had vanished. Theories proliferated in the absence of facts. Had Daniel been abducted? Chief Burke contacted the FBI, and by Monday afternoon, 2 special agents from the Pittsburgh field office had arrived to assess whether this constituted a kidnapping case. They interviewed Grace extensively, asking the difficult questions that had to be asked. Was there a custody dispute? Any relatives who might have taken him? Any suspicious individuals who had shown interest in Daniel? Grace answered each question with increasing desperation, insisting there was no one. Marcus's parents were both deceased. She had no enemies. Daniel was just a little boy who liked birds and books and building things with his best friend. Had he run away? This seemed unlikely for a 10-year-old with no history of behavioral problems, a child described by everyone who knew him as content, well-adjusted, loved. But the police had to consider it. They searched his room for a diary or any indication of unhappiness. They found none. His room was neat, filled with library books about wildlife and astronomy, drawings he'd made of birds and planets, a collection of interesting rocks organized by color and size on a shelf his mother had helped him install. Had he gotten lost in the woods? Daniel loved nature, loved exploring. It was conceivable he'd seen something interesting, a deer, perhaps, or a fox, and followed it into the forest, then become disoriented as darkness fell. This seemed the most likely scenario to many of the searchers, and it became the primary focus of the effort. Teams pushed deeper into the woods on both sides of Red Maple Road, calling Daniel's name until their voices went hoarse, looking for any sign that a child had passed through. Monday night brought no answers. Neither did Tuesday. The search continued. But the initial desperate energy was beginning to fade into something grimmer, a recognition of how unlikely it was that a small boy could survive 2 nights in freezing temperatures without shelter, water, or warm clothing. The temperature Monday night had dropped to 25 degrees. Tuesday night's forecast called for 23. Grace Mercer stopped sleeping entirely. She sat in the command post, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at updates that offered no comfort, praying to a God she'd never been entirely sure she believed in. The media arrived on Tuesday. A reporter from Erie and a camera crew set up near the police station, broadcasting updates about the missing boy from Fairview. By Tuesday evening, the story had been picked up by Pittsburgh stations. By Wednesday morning, it was on the national news. Daniel's school photo, the one from the beginning of 5th grade, where his hair stuck up a little in the back no matter how much Grace had tried to smooth it down, where his smile was slightly crooked and utterly genuine, appeared on television screens across Pennsylvania and beyond. Missing child. 10 years old. Last seen Sunday afternoon. If you have any information, please call. The community continued to rally. The diner on Main Street stayed open around the clock, providing free coffee and sandwiches to searchers. Churches of every denomination held prayer vigils. The elementary school organized a fundraiser to support the search effort, though what money could do at this point was unclear. Tommy Brennan refused to go to school, spent his days walking Red Maple Road with his parents, convinced that he would be the one to find his best friend, because that's how it worked in the stories they liked to read. The ones where friendship was a kind of magic that could overcome anything. It was Harold Hendricks who provided the first real clue, though it came 3 days into the nightmare, and almost wasn't shared at all. Harold was elderly and solitary, the kind of man who'd lived alone so long that he'd forgotten how to engage with the community beyond polite nods at the post office. He'd been questioned on Monday along with the Kowalskis, and the family who happened to be renting the cottage that week. All asked the same questions. Had they seen Daniel on Sunday afternoon? Had they noticed anything unusual? Any unfamiliar vehicles? Any strange people? Harold had answered no to everything, and the officers had moved on. But on Wednesday morning, Harold shuffled down to the police station, pulled off his wool cap with hands gnarled by arthritis, and asked to speak to Chief Burke. When Burke came out to the lobby, Harold explained in his quiet, uncertain voice that he'd remembered something, though he wasn't sure if it mattered, didn't want to waste anyone's time, knew everyone was so busy and worried. Burke, patient despite the exhaustion that pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight, assured Harold that any information could be helpful. Sunday night, Harold said, he'd been unable to sleep. This was not unusual. At his age, sleep came in fragments, and he often found himself awake at odd hours. Around midnight, he'd gotten up to make tea, and while waiting for the water to boil, he'd looked out his kitchen window toward the woods that bordered his property. And he'd seen something he couldn't quite explain. A light, like a lantern or a flashlight, flickering deep in the trees where no one should be, where there were no houses or roads, or any reason for anyone to be at midnight on a Sunday in November. At the time, Harold had dismissed it. Perhaps hunters, he'd thought, though it wasn't hunting season and midnight was an odd time regardless. Perhaps teenagers drinking in the woods, though Fairview's teenagers generally found warmer locations for their rebellions. Perhaps his old eyes playing tricks on him, shadows and moonlight combining into something that wasn't really there. He'd made his tea, returned to bed, and thought no more about it until Wednesday morning when he woke with the nagging sense that maybe, just maybe, it had meant something. Chief Burke studied the old man's face, trying to assess the reliability of a 3-day-old memory from someone who admitted his eyesight wasn't what it used to be. But they had nothing else, no other leads, no direction to turn. He asked Harold to show him exactly where he'd seen the light. Harold agreed, grateful to be taken seriously, and they drove to his house where he stood at his kitchen window and pointed toward a section of woods approximately 200 yards from his property, slightly north of where the tracking dogs had lost Daniel's scent on Red Maple Road. Burke radioed for additional units and search teams. Within an hour, a group of 20 officers and volunteers was assembled, and they pushed into the woods at the point Harold had indicated, fanning out in a careful line, moving slowly, looking for anything that might explain the light or, miracle of miracles, might lead them to Daniel Mercer. The woods there were old growth, mostly oak and maple with an undergrowth of mountain laurel and ferns that had died back for winter. The ground was uneven, riddled with rocks and fallen logs, covered in a thick layer of leaves that had accumulated over decades. It was the kind of terrain that was difficult to navigate even in daylight, and Burke found himself wondering how a 10-year-old child could have gotten far in these conditions, especially in the dark, especially if he were injured or frightened. They searched in a grid pattern, each person staying within sight of the person to their left and right, calling Daniel's name, listening for any response. The afternoon wore on. The sun, already weak at this time of year, began its descent. Some of the volunteers had been searching for 3 days with minimal rest, and it showed in their movements, in the mechanical way they placed one foot in front of the other, in the hoarse quality of their voices when they called out. It was Officer Jennifer Reeves, 28 years old, and the newest member of the Fairview Police Department, who noticed the depression in the ground. She almost walked past it. It was subtle, easy to miss among the general unevenness of the forest floor, but something made her pause and look more carefully. The leaves in one area seemed to have been disturbed, pushed aside or fallen in, and beneath them she could see what looked like concrete, a rim of man-made material incongruous in the natural setting. She called out to Chief Burke, and he made his way to her position, careful not to disturb anything. Together they brushed away more leaves, revealing what appeared to be an old storm shelter, the kind that had been built throughout rural Pennsylvania in the 1940s and 50s, when Cold War fears convinced people that they needed somewhere to hide from atomic bombs that never came. The shelter was mostly underground, with only a concrete lip and a rusted metal door visible above the surface. The door was partially open, perhaps 8 inches, enough that it wouldn't be immediately visible under the accumulated leaves, but enough that something or someone could slip through. Burke's heart began to pound as he knelt beside the opening. He called Daniel's name down into the darkness, his voice echoing slightly in what sounded like a small, enclosed space below. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, and he felt the hope that had sparked begin to die. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that might have been a whimper or a word, something human and alive. The next few minutes were a controlled chaos of radio calls and movement. The door of the storm shelter had to be forced open. The hinges had rusted almost solid over the decades, and it took 3 men with crowbars to pry it wide enough for someone to fit through. Flashlights were produced, pointing down into a darkness that seemed absolute. A ladder, old metal rungs built into the concrete wall, descended about 12 feet into what appeared to be a small underground room, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, designed to hold a family for the duration of an air raid that never happened. Officer Torres volunteered to go down. He was young, fit, and small enough to maneuver in tight spaces. Burke helped him through the opening, watched as Torres's flashlight beam disappeared into the shelter, heard the scrape of boots on metal rungs. Then Torres's voice, muffled by the earth around the shelter but clear enough. "I've got him. He's alive. Get me a medic down here now." The relief that swept through the assembled searchers was physical. People grabbing each other, some crying, some shouting the news to others who couldn't hear Torres. Burke radioed for an ambulance, gave their precise coordinates, then positioned himself at the opening of the shelter to relay information between Torres below and the growing crowd of responders above. Daniel Mercer was alive, but in bad shape. He'd been in the storm shelter for 3 days, Sunday evening through Wednesday afternoon, with no food, minimal water from condensation he'd managed to lick off the walls, and temperatures that had dropped below freezing at night. He had injured his ankle, Torres reported, looked like a bad sprain, or possibly a fracture, which had prevented him from climbing back up the ladder to escape. He was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and going in and out of consciousness. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. He was alive. The medics arrived, and the extraction began. It was delicate work. The shelter's opening was narrow, Daniel was injured, and moving him risked causing additional harm. But leaving him there while they figured out a better solution was not an option. One of the paramedics, a woman named Lisa Chen, who had 15 years of experience and hands that were remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline that must have been coursing through her system, descended into the shelter with a cervical collar, emergency blankets, and an IV kit. She spent 10 minutes stabilizing Daniel as much as possible in the confined space, getting fluids into him, immobilizing his ankle, wrapping him in thermal blankets. Then came the careful process of getting him up the ladder. Torres carried him, Daniel's small body secured to Torres's chest with straps the medics had rigged, climbing one-handed while the other held the boy, moving inch by inch up the metal rungs, while people above reached down to help, to guide, to ensure that after 3 days lost, Daniel Mercer would not fall now, would not be lost again when he was so close to safety. When they emerged into the gray November afternoon, Daniel blinking against even the weak daylight after 3 days in absolute darkness, there was a moment of suspended stillness. Everyone seeing the small figure wrapped in silver thermal blankets, his face pale and dirty, his eyes enormous in his thin face. Then someone started clapping, and the applause spread, mixed with cheers and tears, the sound carrying through the woods to where Grace Mercer stood at the edge of the search area, having been kept back by officers who worried about her seeing something terrible if this ended the way so many feared it would. When she heard the cheers, when she saw the paramedics emerging from the woods carrying a stretcher, when Chief Burke walked toward her with tears running down his weathered face and said, "Grace, we found him? He's alive. We found your boy." She made a sound that was something between a sob and a prayer, and ran toward the stretcher with a speed and strength that belied her 3 days without sleep. The paramedics paused, understanding that this moment belonged to mother and son before it belonged to medical protocols. Grace reached the stretcher and looked down at Daniel, at his face that was so familiar and yet somehow transformed by what he'd endured. And Daniel looked up at his mother with eyes that had seen 3 days and nights alone in darkness and cold. And his cracked lips formed words that would be repeated in news reports and whispered in churches and remembered by everyone who heard them. "I knew you'd find me." The ambulance ride to Fairview General Hospital was swift. Daniel's condition was serious enough to warrant immediate attention, but stable enough that the paramedics were cautiously optimistic. Grace rode in the ambulance, holding his hand, whispering things that only mothers whisper to their children, promises and prayers and expressions of love that didn't need to be overheard to be understood. At the hospital, Daniel was rushed into treatment. He was severely dehydrated, his kidneys showing signs of stress from 3 days without adequate water. His core body temperature was 93 degrees, low enough to be dangerous but not so low that permanent damage was inevitable. His left ankle was fractured, a clean break that would heal but would require casting. He had multiple contusions and abrasions, minor infections starting in cuts on his hands, the beginning of frostbite on his toes. But he was alive, and the doctors, who had feared the worst when they heard a child had been missing for 3 days in freezing temperatures, found themselves using words like lucky and miracle more than they usually allowed themselves in their carefully clinical assessments. While the medical team worked, Chief Burke and the FBI agents interviewed everyone involved in the rescue, piecing together how Daniel had ended up in that storm shelter and how he'd managed to survive. The story that emerged, assembled from Daniel's fragmented account and from the physical evidence found in the shelter, was one of accident, survival, and a 10-year-old boy's determination to be found. Daniel had been walking home on Red Maple Road Sunday evening just as he'd said he would, just as he'd done many times before. As he passed near the woods around the location where the tracking dogs later lost his scent, he'd noticed something that caught his attention. A fox, red and beautiful in the failing light, standing at the edge of the trees. Daniel loved foxes. He'd read about them, drawn pictures of them, begged his mother for months to take him to the zoo in Erie, specifically to see the fox exhibit. Seeing one in the wild, so close to the road, was irresistible. He'd followed it into the woods, not far, he'd thought, just a little way to maybe get a better look, to see where it was going. The fox, being a fox, had vanished almost immediately into the undergrowth, and Daniel had found himself alone among the trees in the gathering darkness. He'd turned to go back, retracing his steps toward the road. But the light was fading fast, and the woods all looked similar, bare trees and rocks and fallen leaves. And he'd gotten turned around. He'd walked in what he thought was the right direction, growing increasingly nervous as the darkness deepened and the temperature dropped. Then, in his hurry and his fear, he'd stepped on the concealed storm shelter opening that had been partially hidden under decades of accumulated leaves. The rusted door had given way under his weight, and he'd fallen through, tumbling down into the darkness below. The fall had been approximately 12 feet. He'd landed badly on his left side, his ankle twisting beneath him with a pain that made him cry out into the empty shelter. For a while, he didn't know how long. Time had lost meaning in the darkness, and pain he'd simply lain there, too shocked and hurt to move. When he finally tried to stand, the pain in his ankle was excruciating, and he'd realized he couldn't put any weight on it, couldn't climb back up the ladder even though he could see the opening above him, a rectangle of slightly less complete darkness against the absolute black of the shelter. He'd called for help until his voice gave out, shouted until his throat was raw, but the shelter was underground, and the woods were empty, and no one heard. As the hours passed and the temperature dropped, he'd felt around the shelter, trying to find anything that might help. The space was mostly empty, a few rusted folding chairs, an old metal drum that had once perhaps held supplies, some scattered debris. But he'd found something else. An old kerosene lantern, the kind that miners used to use, sitting on a shelf built into the concrete wall. At first it seemed useless. There was no kerosene. The glass was cracked, and Daniel had no matches. But as Sunday night stretched into Monday morning and the cold in the shelter became intense enough that he could see his breath in the thin beam of light that filtered down from above, he'd remembered something his grandfather had taught him once during a camping trip, back when his grandfather was still alive and teaching Daniel things about the outdoors. That you could make a spark by striking certain rocks against metal. Daniel had searched the shelter floor in the near darkness, feeling with his hands for the right kind of rock. He'd collected several and tried them one by one against the metal drum, striking them over and over, his hands becoming numb and clumsy with cold. Most produced nothing. But one rock later analysis would show it was quartz. Common in Pennsylvania geology, made a small spark when struck at the right angle against the metal. It had taken him hours. His hands were cut and bleeding from the sharp edges of the rock. His ankle throbbed with a pain that made him feel sick. But finally, he'd managed to get enough sparks to catch a piece of cotton fabric he'd torn from his shirt, creating a tiny flame that he'd carefully transferred to the wick of the old lantern. The flame was small and smoky, the wick was partially rotted, and there was no proper fuel, but it gave off enough light and warmth that Daniel had felt, for the first time since falling into the shelter, a small spark of hope. He'd kept the lantern burning as long as he could, feeding it small pieces of fabric and paper he found in the debris, knowing that even the weak light might be visible through the partially opened door above, might signal to someone that there was a person down here, that he needed help. The lantern had gone out Monday morning when he'd run out of things to burn and couldn't create another spark. His hands were too damaged, and he was too weak. But he'd gotten it burning again on Sunday night, and Harold Hendricks had seen it from his kitchen window, a small flickering light in the woods where no light should be, and that sighting had, 3 days later, led rescuers to this spot. As Daniel's story emerged, it was met with a mixture of amazement and heartbreak. That a 10-year-old child had survived 3 days in those conditions was remarkable. That he'd had the presence of mind to create fire, to attempt to signal for help, spoke to a resourcefulness that many adults wouldn't possess. But the knowledge of what he'd endured, the cold, the pain, the fear, the isolation, was almost too much for the people who loved him to bear. Grace sat by Daniel's hospital bed that Wednesday night, watching him sleep under heated blankets, IV fluids dripping steadily into his arm, his left leg in a cast from foot to knee. The doctors had said he would recover fully. The kidney function would normalize once he was rehydrated. The frostbite on his toes was superficial and would heal without permanent damage. The cuts on his hands would scar, but would function normally. The ankle would heal in 6 to 8 weeks. He was, in medical terms, going to be fine. But Grace knew that fine was a relative term, that the psychological impact of 3 days alone in darkness and cold couldn't be measured in blood tests and x-rays. She'd already spoken with the hospital's child psychologist, who gently explained that Daniel would likely have nightmares, might develop anxiety or claustrophobia, might need considerable support processing what had happened to him. Grace had nodded, absorbing this information, and thought that none of it mattered as long as he was alive, as long as he was here with her, as long as she could sit beside his bed and watch him breathe. The story of Daniel Mercer's disappearance and rescue spread quickly. By Thursday morning, national news outlets were covering it. The image of the small boy being carried out of the woods on a stretcher giving a weak thumbs up to the cameras despite his ordeal, appeared on front pages across the country. The town of Fairview found itself briefly famous as the site of what commentators called a miracle, a happy ending in a world where such stories were rare. Chief Burke held a press conference on Thursday afternoon, answering questions about the search and rescue, praising the volunteers who'd given their time and energy, thanking the FBI and state police for their assistance. When asked about Harold Hendricks and the sighting that had led to Daniel's discovery, Burke's voice grew emotional, and he had to pause before continuing, saying that sometimes the smallest details, the things that seem insignificant, turn out to be the most important, and that Harold's willingness to come forward with information he wasn't even sure mattered had saved a young boy's life. Harold Hendricks, uncomfortable with the attention, declined interview requests, and mostly stayed in his house with his cats, though he did visit Daniel once in the hospital, bringing a book about Pennsylvania wildlife that he thought the boy might enjoy. Daniel, still weak but already showing signs of his resilience, thanked Harold with a sincerity that made the old man's eyes water, and told him that he'd known someone would see the lantern, that he'd believed someone would notice and come find him. The storm shelter itself became a brief point of interest. Investigation revealed it had been built in 1953 by the Jeffries family, who'd owned the dairy farm where it was located. The shelter had been abandoned when the farm closed in the 1970s, and over the decades it had been forgotten, buried under leaves and vegetation, its existence known only to a few elderly residents who remembered the Cold War fears that had prompted its construction. The county decided to seal it properly to prevent any future accidents, but before they did, they allowed Grace Mercer to retrieve one item: the old kerosene lantern that had been Daniel's lifeline and his beacon. Daniel remained in the hospital for a week, monitored for complications that thankfully never developed. During that time, visitors streamed through his room. Tommy Brennan and his parents, Daniel's teachers and classmates, neighbors who'd joined the search, police officers who'd worked around the clock to find him. Daniel was polite to everyone, grateful for their concern, but Grace could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he seemed to retreat into himself when too many people crowded into the room. She began limiting visitors, protecting her son's space and energy, knowing that recovery would require more than physical healing. When Daniel was finally discharged on November 22nd, 10 days after his disappearance, the town organized a small welcome home gathering. It was subdued, not celebratory. No one wanted to overwhelm the boy or turn his trauma into a spectacle, but meaningful. As Grace drove Daniel home along the same roads he'd walked that Sunday afternoon, people stood on their porches and waved, holding signs that said, "Welcome home, Daniel," and "We love you, Daniel," and simple messages of relief and joy. At home, Daniel had trouble sleeping. Grace had expected this, and she'd prepared, moving a cot into his room so she could be there when he woke from nightmares, when he cried out in the darkness, when he needed the reassurance that he was safe, that he was home, that he wasn't alone in the cold and the dark. The nightmares came frequently at first, several times a night, and Grace would hold him and murmur comfort until he fell back asleep, exhausted from his fear. The child psychologist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, visited twice a week. She worked with Daniel on processing his experience, on understanding that what had happened to him was scary, but was over, that he'd survived something difficult, and that surviving made him strong, not damaged. She used play therapy and art therapy, having Daniel draw pictures of the shelter, of the woods, of the rescue, helping him externalize his fears so they wouldn't fester inside. Gradually, over weeks and then months, the nightmares became less frequent and less intense. Tommy Brennan was a constant presence, coming over after school to sit with Daniel, to tell him about classes he'd missed, to carefully not ask about the shelter unless Daniel wanted to talk about it. The boys returned to their building projects, though now they worked in Daniel's backyard, where Grace could see them from the kitchen window, where the open sky was visible above them, where there were no enclosed spaces or darkness. They built a bird feeder together, a complex structure with multiple perches and feeding stations, and Daniel spent hours watching the birds that came to it, identifying them, sketching them in a notebook Dr. Martinez had given him. As winter deepened and then gave way to early spring, Daniel slowly returned to himself. He went back to school in January, facing the stares and whispers of classmates who'd seen him on television, who knew what had happened to him. It was difficult at first, the attention making him uncomfortable, but his teacher, Mrs. Holm, and the school counselor worked to normalize his presence, to treat him as Daniel the student rather than Daniel the survivor, and eventually the other children followed suit. The lantern became a fixture in the Mercer kitchen, sitting on a shelf that Grace had cleared specifically for it. She'd cleaned it carefully, removing the rust and debris as best she could, while preserving its essential character as the object that had helped save her son. Sometimes she would look at it while washing dishes or preparing meals, and she would think about the 3 days when she didn't know if Daniel was alive or dead, the longest 72 hours of her existence, and she would send a silent prayer of thanks to whatever combination of chance and determination and Harold Hendricks's insomnia had brought her boy back to her. Daniel's relationship with the lantern was more complex. Sometimes he would look at it and feel a sense of pride, remembering how he'd managed to create fire in the cold and dark, how he'd tried to signal for help. Other times he would look at it and feel the remembered fear, the desperation of those hours when the flame was his only companion, and he wasn't sure if anyone would see it, if anyone would come. Dr. Martinez explained that both responses were normal, that the lantern represented both his trauma and his survival, and that over time he would integrate these feelings into a more complete understanding of what he'd experienced. The community of Fairview slowly returned to its normal rhythms. The news crews departed. The out-of-state volunteers went home. Life resumed its ordinary patterns of school and work, of seasons changing, of the small dramas and joys that constitute existence in a town of 800 people. But there was a subtle shift, an awareness of how quickly normal could become nightmare, of how precious each ordinary day was. People hugged their children a little tighter. They paid more attention to the elderly neighbors who lived alone. They checked on each other more frequently, understanding that community wasn't just a word, but a practice, a choice to care about the people around you. Red Maple Road remained as it had always been, a quiet stretch lined with bare trees in winter and green ones in summer, connecting one part of town to another. But now when people drove it, they remembered. They remembered the search parties that had walked it again and again, calling a boy's name into the darkness. They remembered the tracking dogs losing the scent. They remembered the 3 days when it seemed like the road had swallowed a child whole. And they remembered the relief when he was found, the miracle that he'd survived, the lantern that had burned in the dark. In the months following his rescue, Daniel began to write. It started with Dr. Martinez's suggestion that he keep a journal, a place to put his thoughts and feelings that would be private, just for him. But writing became more than therapy. It became a way for Daniel to process and understand his experience, to shape it into something that made sense. He wrote about the fear he'd felt falling into the shelter. He wrote about the cold and the darkness. He wrote about his grandfather's camping lessons that had taught him how to make fire. He wrote about his certainty that his mother would find him, that he just had to stay alive long enough for her to get there. When he showed some of his writing to Dr. Martinez, she was struck by its clarity and honesty. The way this 10-year-old boy had managed to articulate things that many adults struggled to express. She suggested, gently, that sharing his story might help other children who'd experienced scary things, might help them understand they weren't alone. Daniel considered this carefully, as he considered most things, and eventually agreed. His account was published in a children's magazine the following fall, a simple first-person narrative about getting lost and being found, about being scared but not giving up, about knowing that people were looking for you even when you couldn't see them. The article reached thousands of children and their parents. Letters arrived at the Mercer house from around the country, from kids who'd been through their own traumas and found comfort in knowing that someone else understood, and from parents who read Daniel's words and better understood what their own children might be feeling. Grace kept the letters in a box, thinking that someday Daniel might want to look back and see the impact his willingness to share had created. As Daniel moved through 5th grade and into 6th, as his ankle healed and his nightmares became rare, and his hands lost the lingering stiffness from his time in the cold, he found that his experience had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He was more cautious now, more aware of his surroundings and of potential dangers. But he was also more confident, knowing that he'd faced something terrifying and survived, that he had resources within himself he hadn't known existed. He still loved birds and books and building things with Tommy. But now he also loved the ordinary moments, the unremarkable days at school and evenings at home, in a way that only someone who's lost those things can fully appreciate. Grace watched her son grow and change, saw him integrating his experience into his identity rather than being defined by it. She saw him help younger children who were scared, drawing on his own fear to understand theirs. She saw him defend a classmate who was being bullied, standing up with a quiet courage that made her heart ache with pride. She saw him choosing kindness again and again, as if having experienced isolation and fear had made him determined that others wouldn't feel the same. The anniversary of Daniel's disappearance came and went. November 12th was marked quietly in the Mercer household, a day of private reflection rather than public commemoration. Daniel went to school as usual. Grace worked as usual. But that evening, they sat together in the kitchen, looking at the lantern on its shelf, and they talked about that week in a way they hadn't before. Daniel told his mother details he'd never shared, how he'd sung to himself to stay awake in the cold, how he'd counted the hours by watching the small amount of light that filtered down from above change from gray to black to gray again, how he'd made up stories in his head about the rescue, imagining different scenarios for how it would happen. Grace shared her own experience of those 3 days, the terror that had felt like it would never end, the way time had moved differently when she didn't know if her child was alive or dead, the guilt she'd felt for letting him walk alone, even though it was a route he'd taken dozens of times safely, the moment when Chief Burke told her they'd found him, and she'd felt her heart restart after 3 days of feeling like it had stopped. They cried together, mother and son, mourning the innocence that had been lost but celebrating the strength that had been found. And when they were done crying, they made hot chocolate, the same kind Mrs. Brennan had served on that last normal afternoon, and they sat at the table and talked about simpler things, about school and friends and the bird feeder in the backyard, and the everyday matters that constitute a life. The lantern remained on its shelf year after year, as Daniel grew from a 10-year-old boy into a teenager and then a young man. It was there when he graduated from 8th grade, from high school, when he left for college where he studied wildlife biology, drawn to the natural world that had both endangered and fascinated him. It was there when Grace remarried, finding love again with a kind man who understood that her heart had room for both him and the memory of Marcus, and who treated Daniel with a gentle respect that honored his experiences without defining him by them. It was there through ordinary days and extraordinary ones through grief and joy and all the complex mixture of experiences that make up a human life. Sometimes visitors would ask about the lantern, noticing it on its shelf, and Grace would tell the story. The details never changed the November afternoon, the walk that should have been ordinary, the 3 days of searching, the light that Harold Hendricks saw from his window, the spark that Daniel created in the darkness. But the meaning of the story evolved over time, becoming less about the trauma and more about the resilience, less about the fear and more about the hope, less about being lost and more about being found. Daniel eventually became a park ranger, working in Pennsylvania's state forests, helping others safely explore the natural world he loved. He often thought about that November when he was 10, about how his love of foxes had led him into danger and how his determination to survive had led him out. He taught wilderness safety classes, emphasizing preparation and caution, but also the importance of staying calm, of using whatever resources you have, of believing that help is coming even when you can't see it yet. And when he talked about survival, when he explained to worried parents and eager children what to do if they ever found themselves lost or in danger, he always ended the same way. Don't give up. People are looking for you. Keep going until they find you. The storm shelter where Daniel had fallen was eventually filled in and sealed, the county deciding it represented too much liability to leave accessible. But before it was filled, Grace visited it one time. She stood at the edge, looking down into the darkness that had held her son for 3 days, and she tried to imagine what he'd experienced, what he'd felt, what had kept him going. She couldn't fully grasp it. No one who hadn't been there could, but standing in that place helped her understand in a deeper way how much courage Daniel had shown, how remarkable his survival had been. She left a small plaque near the site, installed with the county's permission, that read, "In this place, Daniel Mercer survived." November 12th to 15th, 2006. It stood as both a memorial and a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope persists. The town of Fairview continued its quiet existence, new families moving in as old families passed on or moved away. Children growing up hearing the story of the boy who fell into the storm shelter and survived. The story became part of the town's oral history, told and retold, slightly different in each telling but always ending the same way, with rescue, with survival, with the small miracle of a lantern in the darkness. Red Maple Road remained unchanged, its trees cycling through seasons, its pavement cracking and being repaired, its character as a rural connector between neighborhoods staying constant even as everything around it slowly evolved. And in Grace Mercer's kitchen, through all the years and changes and ordinary passage of time, the lantern remained on its shelf. It was cleaned occasionally, but never restored to anything resembling newness. The rust remained, the cracked glass stayed cracked, the dented metal bore the marks of its history. It had become something more than an object. It was a symbol of a moment when everything could have been lost, but wasn't, when darkness could have won but didn't, when a small boy's determination and a community's love had combined to create something that people would remember decades later. Grace sometimes thought about what she'd told the reporters back in November of 2006, in the hours after Daniel was found, when she was exhausted and relieved and trying to make sense of what had happened. She'd said she kept the lantern as a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope still shines. Years later, she would stand in her kitchen making breakfast or washing dishes, and she would glance at the lantern, and she would think that it represented more than just hope. It represented the human capacity to survive impossible circumstances. It represented the power of love to drive people to keep searching even when logic said to give up. It represented the importance of community, of neighbors looking out for each other, of old men who report strange lights even when they're not sure it matters. It represented the way that small actions, striking a rock against metal, looking out a window at midnight, deciding to come forward with uncertain information, can have enormous consequences. Most of all, the lantern represented Daniel himself, the boy who became a man who lived a full and meaningful life, not despite what happened to him in that storm shelter, but in some ways because of it, because surviving the unsurvivable gave him a perspective on life that was both hard-won and precious. He understood that every day above ground was a gift. He understood that the people who love you never stop looking, never stop trying to bring you home. He understood that darkness is real and fear is real, but that the human spirit's capacity to create light in that darkness is equally real and ultimately more powerful. The story of Daniel Mercer and the lantern on Red Maple Road became, over time, not just a story about a boy who got lost and was found, but a story about what it means to survive, to hope, to love, to refuse to give up even when giving up would be easier. It became a story that parents told their children to help them understand that bad things can happen, but that those bad things don't have to define you. That being scared is okay as long as you keep going. That people care about you even when you can't see them. And every November 12th, Grace would take the lantern down from its shelf and dust it carefully and remember. She would remember the boy who fell into darkness and created his own light. She would remember the 3 days that felt like 3 lifetimes. She would remember the moment when Chief Burke told her that Daniel was alive, and her world that had been ending suddenly began again. She would remember watching her son grow up, watching him heal, watching him become someone who used his pain to help others rather than letting it diminish him. Then she would place the lantern back on its shelf where it belonged, where it would remain as a permanent reminder of that November, of that darkness, of that light, of the boy who refused to give up, and the mother who refused to stop looking, and the community that refused to stop caring, and the old man who refused to dismiss what he'd seen from his kitchen window, and the rescuers who refused to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. The lantern would sit there through another year, through seasons changing outside the window, through ordinary days that were miraculous simply because they were ordinary, because Daniel was there to experience them, because the story had ended not with loss, but with finding, not with darkness, but with light. And that light, small and imperfect and born of desperation in the cold darkness of a forgotten storm shelter, continued to shine through the years in the hearts and memories of everyone who knew the story. A permanent reminder that even when all seems lost, even when the darkness feels absolute, hope still burns. All it takes is a spark, a refusal to surrender, and the belief that somewhere, someone is looking for you, someone is coming to bring you home. In the end, that belief, that fundamental trust in the persistence of love and hope and human connection was what had saved Daniel Mercer in November of 2006. And it was what the lantern on Red Maple Road represented, would always represent. For as long as it sat on that kitchen shelf, a small rusted object carrying an enormous weight of meaning, a beacon that once burned in darkness and now burned in memory, lighting the way for everyone who heard its story and understood that survival is possible, that rescue is real, that even in the deepest darkness, light can be created by those who refuse to give up.